As we said goodbye to the previous generation of consoles in 2013, The Last of Us served as one hell of a send-off for the PS3. To this day, it's held up as one of the best narratives in gaming, and for my money, it provided a tense and dynamic gameplay experience on top of that. The Last of Us Part 2 finds itself in a similar position, releasing in the final months of the PS4, and while it's hard to call it an outright better game, I do think that it serves as a worthy sequel to a game that never really needed one. Full disclosure, there are some pretty easily spoiled plot points in The Last of Us Part 2, and while I can be vague enough to keep the game's surprises intact, its second half introduces some elements that kind of necessitate a bit of spoiler talk. So, instead of spoiling anything outright here, any talk of those elements that skirt spoiler territory will be in this video. So once you're done here, I encourage you to check that video out if you don't mind some light spoiler discussion. Now, on with the review. The Last of Us Part 2 picks up about 4 years after the events of the first game, with Joel and Ellie living a peaceful life among other survivors in Jackson, Wyoming. Or at least as peaceful a life as a world with creepy fungus zombies will allow. Before long, however, the horror of the outside world finds its way back into their lives, sending Ellie on a hunt for violent retribution following a traumatizing run-in with a group of outsiders. On the whole, it's an incredibly grim story being told here, as The Last of Us Part 2 deals with themes of hatred, pain, and the cost of perpetuating the cycle of violence that these notions breed. It's not new territory for video games to cover, but for what it's worth, the game's writing handles those subjects well enough, if a little heavy-handed at times. The events shown in-game are often brutal and confronting even in its earliest hours, and it can sometimes feel excessive. That's not to say that The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't have some moments of respite from the crushing despair that hangs over the narrative, but where the first game would use similar scenes to remind you that hope still existed in its cruel world, the sequel seems more focused on reminding you of the last bits of light that you lose by sinking further into the darkness. It's a good thing then that The Last of Us Part 2 at least gives you some company on Ellie's grim journey, and the game's cast of believable, well-rounded characters do a decent job of reminding you that as long as you have friends, you haven't lost everything. The interactions between these characters in particular are where I think the game's writing is at its strongest as well. The relationship between Ellie and Dina, her girlfriend, feels particularly grounded and provides a crucial, if small, element of joy to the proceedings. Meanwhile, the bond between Ellie and Joel has become strained over time, and a large focus of the game is exploring the emotions behind and consequences of the closing moments of the previous game. The Last of Us Part 2 even begins with Joel recounting those events to his brother, underlining just how important that event is in relation to everything in this sequel. What really makes the writing of The Last of Us Part 2 shine, however, is the superb acting bringing it to life. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson once again deliver captivating performances as Joel and Ellie, and Laura Bailey brings some serious intensity to her performance as new character Abby. But this voice acting quality doesn't stop with the main cast. Even the enemy NPCs of the game feel convincingly lifelike thanks to their out-of-conflict conversations and the fact that they call to each other by name, something that I'm not used to hearing in most games, which can make engaging with them a genuinely uncomfortable experience. The game's impressive voice work is accompanied by some truly spectacular visuals, as the world of The Last of Us Part 2 is brought to life in gorgeous and horrific detail. On the one hand, the game's facial capture may just be the most impressive I've seen in any video game, enhancing the already stellar performances of the cast. Furthermore, Part 2's environments are surprisingly varied and full of personality. It's easy to sum up the majority of the game as ruined cityscapes, and you wouldn't be wrong, but there's a marked difference in feeling between the snowy outskirts of Jackson and the street-turned rapids of downtown Seattle, you know? Now on the other hand, The Last of Us Part 2 looks downright disgusting in some places, but in the sense that it's still super impressive visually. There are plenty of dark hallways overgrown with fungus that feel really oppressive, but even then, it's hard not to be blown away by the tiny spores floating in the air or the off-putting designs of the zombies, especially the new Shambler enemy. These often long-abandoned environments feel particularly lonely thanks to the sparse but evocative soundtrack, which should please fans of the previous game's music. Capping all of that off are some super impactful, hard-hitting animations and a stomach-churning level of gore that on one level feels in line with The Last of Us Part 2's core themes. On another level though, the game's stance on violence feels kind of hypocritical, as these brutal animations help the game feel super satisfying to play. It's honestly kind of hard to feel bad about all the video game violence I'm enacting when it ultimately feels really good to enact. On that note, let's talk gameplay. The Last of Us Part 2 takes the stealth, combat, and light puzzle elements of the previous game and just does them better, whether that's through the addition of new elements like enemy types and traversal options, or the refinement of what was already there. Like the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 features my favorite kind of stealth system, one that's loose enough to allow you to make a mistake or two without immediately setting an entire zone on alert. You got spotted by one enemy? No big deal, just silence them and get back to sneaking. Now that's not to say that enemies are stupid, they just act reasonably. As with any good stealth game, the AI is predictable enough for players to plan around, but The Last of Us Part 2 does a good job of making its human sentries feel more believable. Guards don't feel like they walk along preset routes, especially not once you put them on alert, and even when they do, it's in a way that makes sense, by checking their corners or patrolling in a grid. Of course, your stealth tools from The Last of Us make a return, so you aren't totally at the mercy of Part 2's smarter AI. You've got the game's Listen mode, which lets you scope out enemy locations from relative safety, as well as throwable items that can be used to draw guards' attention elsewhere. With that said, The Last of Us Part 2 does introduce a few new threats to keep you from getting complacent. The game's new enemy types in particular feel as though they're introduced to keep you moving, and more importantly, to force you to make mistakes. On the human side of things, the game has attack dogs who are able to track your scent as long as you're close by, forcing you to put distance between yourself and them as quickly as possible. Avoiding them entirely is your safest bet, but once they have your scent, there's a good chance you'll just blunder into enemy sightlines while trying to get away from them. The infected have some new tricks up their sleeve as well. While the threat of the sound-alerted clickers is somewhat lessened by Ellie's switchblade, which negates the use of the first game's shivs, this game's new zombies more than make up for it. On the one hand, you have the Shambler, a takedown immune infected whose entire game plan is based around charging you down and covering you in acid. More interesting, however, is the Stalker, an enemy type whose sole purpose is to give you a taste of your own stealthy medicine. Staying still in an encounter with these stealthy creeps gives them the opportunity to silently maneuver around players, and if they manage to jump you, you can be sure that every other infected in the zone will be on their way to beat you down. Now, when stealth inevitably fails, The Last of Us Part 2 still has its combat to fall back on, and for the most part, there haven't been many significant changes to the previous game's mechanics. They're a little bit more responsive from the get-go without sacrificing the weightiness of the previous game, and you'll eventually have a surprising array of weapons at your disposal. The game still uses its real-time crafting system as well, so building Molotovs or first aid kits in the middle of a fight is just as tense as it ever was previously. The addition of a proper dodge certainly makes the game's awesome dynamic melee a much more tantalizing option, but beyond that feature, the aspect of combat that I noticed the most was the game's refined enemy AI. I was caught off guard by how often survivors were successfully flanking me and effectively using their numbers advantage to keep me pinned down. Thankfully, you have some of that on your side as well, as I found that ally AI was almost as good at pointing out threats that I'd missed as the enemy was at getting the drop on me. Probably the most important mechanical additions to the game, however, are The Last of Us Part 2's expanded traversal options. Beyond crouching and climbing up structures, the game gives you the ability to go prone and crawl underneath obstacles or hide in medium-length grass. It also features plenty of wall gaps for you to slide between, and both of these options give you a greater ability to slip past enemies. These new tools are fantastic, but they would mean nothing without solid level design backing them up, and The Last of Us Part 2's levels are put together exceptionally well. Aside from one mini sandbox-style zone early on, the game is generally made up of open encounter zones strung together by more linear areas, and both of these types of environment offer plenty of chances for exploration. The encounter zones often feature multiple obvious paths through a zone, as well as some more subtle options, and it helps the encounters themselves feel really dynamic. You can go from stealth to a shootout to scrambling through ruined buildings all in the same non-scripted zone thanks to the freedom of movement that you're afforded, and it feels really natural. The linear zones, in contrast, usually have very clear, singular paths, though they still offer a couple of offshoot rooms that you're encouraged to explore. Even with this more closed-in design, these sections are still engaging thanks to some light puzzle elements that involve manipulating environmental features to progress. Like The Last of Us, you can still move dumpsters and ladders around to climb, but I think it's worth mentioning Part 2's rope mechanics specifically. Areas that give you access to a rope let you climb, abseil, and swing off them, but you often have the ability to set that rope up by lobbing it over bars as well. It's a deceptively simple concept, but I quite often found myself surprised by how much the game does with this one gimmick. Now, there's no point in having all these nooks and crannies and open levels if you don't have stuff to find in them. To that end, The Last of Us Part 2, like its predecessor, has plenty of collectible notes to find which help you flesh out the world, as well as materials that let you upgrade your character skills and weapons. These upgrade options have altered in some interesting ways, but it's all pretty straightforward. Scrap is still required to make new weapon attachments, but you no longer have to collect easily missed toolkits to access more powerful upgrades. On the flip side, character upgrades offer a little less choice, requiring you to unlock them sequentially rather than picking and choosing from a wide range of skills from the start. On top of that, you do have to find skill books to unlock new skill trees, so while weapon upgrades have been streamlined, character upgrades give you some more options at the cost of some freedom of choice. Now, if you're like me, then you'll probably be scouring each level as thoroughly as you can, but even without trying to collect everything, The Last of Us Part 2 delivers a lot of game. We're talking upwards of 20 hours, even if you rush some things. That might be too long to be subjected to the game's onslaught of despair, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't ready for it to end at least twice before the ending finally did hit. While I ultimately enjoyed my 23 hours with the game, it definitely buckles under just how much story is packed into it. Honestly, the game's epilogue feels almost like it could be expanded out to be its own separate game, and is probably the part that feels the most easily trimmed since it's preceded by one of the game's perfectly good stopping points. What I'm trying to say is that if you're worried that this game won't provide enough bang for your buck, then don't. It's massive. Even without mentioning its New Game Plus mode, this game is huge. So with all that, The Last of Us Part 2 is excellent. On a purely technical level, The Last of Us Part 2 is a brilliant game, with gorgeous visuals, intense sound design, and compelling performances backing up what is, in my opinion, an overall improved gameplay experience. Apart from that one time I fell through the world. Whoops. Whether we're talking about its stealth, combat, or light traversal puzzles, The Last of Us Part 2 makes for a noticeably more enjoyable experience to play than its predecessor. And also, there is a frankly astonishing number of accessibility options included that I haven't even touched on. From multiple different subtitle tweaks to high contrast visuals, The Last of Us Part 2 might be the most mechanically accessible AAA game out there. My only real qualm with the game is that its primary themes feel at odds with that super fun gameplay, and while there is some solid writing on display here, the parade of misery that is Part 2's story can get to be a bit much at times, especially considering just how long it is. I recommend fans of the first game check it out with an open mind, but newcomers to the franchise should probably play the original beforehand, since a lot of The Last of Us Part 2's strength is in its exploration of that game's events. The Last of Us Part 2 is out now on PlayStation 4. Please be sure to check out Part 2 of this review if you don't mind some light spoiler talk.